Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is writer-editor Danny Fingeroth. Danny, welcome to Comic Culture.
Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Danny, you are known for a period of time that you were editing at Marvel Comics during the heady days of the 1980s. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you got started as an editor.
I was there from the 70s through the 90s. I covered many decades. I got started the old-fashioned way. I knew somebody. So that, I did and I didn't. I'm being a little facetious. I knew some, because I'm a New York City native, as are many of the people who invented the original comics and superheroes. I went to college. I got a degree in avant-garde filmmaking at Binghamton University. Which was a great education and a great degree, but not maybe the most practical thing that I could have done. But, I got this incredible visionary worldview and education. I did what a lot of young people do when they finish college. I came home and crashed with my mom. That, of course, happened to be on the island of Manhattan, which was, as I like to say, I was born, raised, and lived my entire life on the island of Manhattan, making me the most provincial person you'll ever meet. I thought, okay, I might want to do. I did some kind of schlepping jobs in the local New York film business, and contemplated graduate school and contemplated learning to be a chef. And then I said, I love comics. I wasn't following the Marvels super closely. I was more into the undergrounds, and especially American Splendor and Harvey Pekar I was a big fan of. I said, it might be fun to work at Marvel Comics. And I happened to have a contact that could get me in the door for an informational tour. Not so close a contact that could get me a job there, but someone get me in on a tour. So I went on that tour, and I dropped my resume with several offices, and I'm sure they immediately went into their waste paper baskets. But I did run into someone I went to high school with who was working there, who, when a job came open like 6 months later, let me know about it. And that job was working as Larry Lieber's assistant in what was then called the British Department. Larry, of course, is Stan Lee's brother, and the two of them did the Spider-Man newspaper strip. Larry's also one of the co-creators of Thor and Iron Man and Ant-Man and Groot. And Larry's still kicking today. He's doing a lot of his own. He just left the Spider-Man strip shortly before Stan passed away. And Larry's doing a lot of interesting creative work that maybe you'll have him on to talk about sometime. But Larry hired me to be his assistant. In the British department, it was mostly reprint material, but the new material we did was for a character called Captain Britain, who's very well known today, but then was only published in the British weekly comics. And Captain Britain, of course, was created mostly by people from the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens, because, after all, the word Queen is in Queens, and Brooklyn is Kingsborough, so it's got that sort of royal British tie. But anyway, so it was mostly reprint material, which gave me a chance to refamiliarize myself with stuff I'd read as a kid, and to read stuff that I'd missed in the years that I hadn't been a regular mainstream comic book reader. And so we put together weekly comics for publication in England. That was the British market then. Things like Beano and 2000 AD. So there was a black and white British weekly comic market, and we were trying to compete in that. And I would do important things like changing the spelling of color to color, changing elevator to lift, But and as I said, doing a fair amount of new material with Captain Britain and new covers and new splash page. So that was the beginning, and then through there, so I worked with Larry for about a year and a half, and then the British department decided to actually move to England. A guy named Des Skin, who some of your listeners or viewers may have heard of, who was the publisher of the British Mad magazine at the time. And then went on to do Warrior and had a very illustrious career. But he convinced Marvel that perhaps the British Marvels should be put out by people actually living in England. Actually, my counterpart, because we did have a British office, sort of the assistant editor in the London office was a guy named Neil Tennant, who went on to become one of the Pet Shop Boys. That's a little piece of trivia. But that's how I started. And then from there, I ended up becoming Archie Goodwin's assistant on Star Wars, because the British comics were using Star Wars at double the rate of the American comics. So it made sense for me to be involved with that. And then I worked with Carmine Infantino on extra covers and extra splash pages for the British editions. And then at a certain point, I segued, after they brought, I was still the British liaison. After they brought the British editorial offices mostly over to England, I then became a shared assistant between Jim Shooter and Sal Brodsky, and that's when I did I helmed a line of reprint books, and shortly thereafter, I became Louise Jones, or you may know as Louise Simonson's assistant on the X-Men books when she came over from Warren Publishing. So I sort of had a multi-step entry into the business. I did not come from capital F fandom. I was, I'm of the baby boom generation. I was the perfect age to have my brain taken over by the early Marvel, starting Fantastic Four #4 was the first Marvel I knowingly bought off the stands. I think I'd actually been reading Millie the Model in the barbershop and not Millie the Model in the barbershop. In the barbershop, I was reading Millie. I don't know if Millie ever went to a barbershop, although she had so many comics. She probably did at some point. But I was not someone who went to a lot of comic conventions, and didn't write a lot of letters in. But I had this fondness for those characters and for the medium in general.
And you end up editing perhaps the signature character of Marvel Comics. You end up editing The Amazing Spider-Man, and that's got to be daunting. I mean, you've worked your way up through the ranks, you've learned your craft, but it's kind of like, playing center field for the New York Yankees.
I'd say it's more like, I don't know, maybe center field. I mean, I know what you're saying with the center field. I guess it's like that in the sense that, what some people love about baseball and hate about baseball is that even center field for the New York Yankees, a lot of the time you're just standing there trying to look good, and occasionally when somebody hits a fly ball your way, you try to catch it, But so what I mean by that is there's a certain way in which Spider-Man is editor-proof, artist-proof, writer-proof. He's Spider-Man. You've got him people have him on Slurpee cups and underoos and calendars, and but so on the one hand, it's like, okay, it's almost automatic, but it's, but of course you want it to be as good as you can. And of course, then the better it is, the more it will, ideally sell. And there's a certain, so aside from the commercial aspects, there's a certain pride that you take in being in the major leagues like that and playing center field for the Yankees. So, it was a real challenge, and I did it 2 different periods, in the 80s and in the 90s, because of different. I don't know how deep in the weeds you want to get, but sort of my career had various phases, as careers tend to do. And but the period you're talking about, it was interesting there. Also, it either was just the beginning, or maybe it even, at a certain point, I don't know if they still have them, but there were editors' royalties. So, people then, there was a sense of jockeying for getting the higher selling books because you'd make more money. But at that point, there either hadn't been the royalties, or maybe it had just kicked in and nobody really kind of understood, in literal terms, what that could mean financially. So, it wasn't, I happened to get the Spider-Man books because there was a little bit of a staff shuffling. Tom DeFalco was promoted to be executive editor, and a couple other positions shifted around. And so the Spider-Man books were just what was open. I think it was only under Tom a few years before that the idea of even bringing all the Spider-Man books into one family editorial grouping came together. It used to be, I guess, that DC was Superman too. It was just the various titles relating to their flagship character would be spread among other editors. There was a certain amount of coordination, but the idea of actually, and I guess this is actually, I should take that back about DC. I guess the old 40s, 50s, 60s DC structure was families of characters, would be under one editor, and so that was a relatively new concept. So the thing about Spider-Man is, if there's no royalties and if you're just being judged on the quality of your work and getting your books in on time, then there's no big advantage to an editor in comics to take on something so high profile. In some ways, the incentive for an editor is to do what you'll enjoy or what might play to your strengths or your interests. Once there's a royalty system involved, I think there is more, understandably more jockeying for a certain group of comics or certain characters. Not always. I mean, I think, I'd say there was less of that than you would think, because along with editing Spider-Man or editing the X-Men comes a lot of pressure and a lot of performance anxiety.
And at the time that you are the editor, we see some of the bigger changes in that character's history, and some that actually have held fast throughout the years of comics. The black costume, Mary Jane Watson understanding or revealing that she knows Peter Parker is Spider-Man. And you actually were able to hire a relatively unknown writer to write an annual issue, a guy by the name of Stan Lee. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you put those sort of books together and get somebody like Stan Lee wanting to script an annual for you.
A lot of things happened in the early and mid-'80s. It was really the beginning of the prominence of the direct market, which was proven, of course, by Dazzler #1 selling 400,000 non-returnable copies. So then you're not just publishing for like a casual reader who happens to pass a newsstand and sees, oh, there's Spider-Man's name in red letters, I'm going to buy that. You're dealing with a more informed, educated, and jaded audience. So then you're suddenly doing stuff like changing Spider-Man's costume or making him a clone or putting him in a big multi-issue crossover. I know there was one story point that you had asked about in your question that I wanted to.
I'd asked about or mentioned the Mary Jane Watson reveal, and of course,
hundreds of people have worked on Spider-Man over the years, and everybody brings something to the table. But there are maybe 4 or 5 writers who really, I feel, get the character. So I don't mean to slight anybody I don't mention, but Tom DeFalco, Roger Stern, J.M. DeMatteis, Bill Mantlo. Again, I'm sure I'm forgetting, but these are people who bring something to the table and a passion for the character and an understanding of the every person aspect of Spider-Man. One of my favorite conversations I ever had with Tom, who of course for many years was the editor-in-chief, but I said to Tom one day, help me out here. Spider-Man sometimes says that he's Spider-Man because he feels guilty about Uncle Ben and responsible, hence power responsibility. Sometimes he does it because he needs to make money to help support Aunt May. Sometimes he says he does it because he just likes to play jokes on Jameson. Sometimes he does it just to forget about his troubles as Peter and because it's fun to be Spider. What motivates him? And Tom said, the guy doesn't have a clue, which means he's just like all of us. We all have a narrative we tell ourselves. Here's why I do what I do. Here's what I did yesterday. Here's why I chose the career I did. Here's why I bought this car. Here's why I have this girlfriend. But we don't really know. We're just guessing. And so Peter is really that. When he's in a good mood, it's great to be Spider-Man. When he's in a bad mood, it's the worst possible curse in the world to be Spider-Man. And so I think Tom, those people I mentioned, Tom and DeMatteis and Stern and a few others. And of course, that brings you to Stan Lee, who, of course, co-created the character with Steve Ditko. And both those guys, have to be on the list of people who understand Spider-Man, even though they didn't actually always agree on who Spider-Man was, as we famously know. I think Stan, this is one of those things I should have a better story for. This is the 1984 Spider-Man annual. Stan had been writing the newspaper strip all along, and of course he'd been in Hollywood for a few years then, trying to move the Marvel characters onto TV and movies. And somehow I found out that he was interested in doing some work for the comics. I cannot tell you the exact origin of that, but I know it's a story plotted by Tom DeFalco, drawn by Ron Frenz, inks by Bob Layton and Jackson Geiss. And it was weird editing Stan Lee's script because he was, he was Stan Lee. He was the guy who started started the Marvel phenomenon, co-created the characters, edited, art directed. I would then have the responsibility or the power, I don't know what you want to call it, of editing his script. And for whatever reason, I felt it was appropriate for me to give him notes and tell him, I think this works and that doesn't work. And instead of just saying to me, well, who cares what you think? I'm Stan Lee. He was totally professional. He's like, oh, that's a good idea. Or no, I don't agree with that. And here's why, but you're the boss. So so it was very surreal. And then I ended up being his editor numerous times, over the years. And every time it was, I guess over time it got to be less surreal and unreal and just a thing. But I did work with him a lot at Marvel. I actually ended up working with him a lot more after I left Marvel, interestingly, because I went to work for a couple of other mostly online entertainment companies. And because I was the guy who knew Stan, and it was sort of my job to bring him in and get him involved with things we were doing. And then with my magazine that I put out for 7 years for Tomorrow's, the Right Now magazine, Stan, I often interviewed him for that. And I knew him a little bit, but not well. So it was strange and intimidating and obviously memorable, except that I don't remember that one thing. How did he specifically, get that? He liked to write, and maybe his schedule was a little light in Hollywood or something. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting because you were able to, like you said, able to interview him for it was a Right Now magazine for Tomorrow's Publishing, and you've become sort of a historian of comics. You've written a number of books about comic creators and comic history, including Stan Lee, A Marvelous Life. So I was wondering, when you approach someone like a Stan Lee as a subject rather than as a colleague or a friend, how do you sort of get that research started? Is it mostly because you've spoken to him so many times, or do you have to hit the library and try and find those resources?
Well, just to edit you, the correct the full title is called A Marvelous Life: The Amazing Story of Stan Lee. And by the way, the paperback is out, the hardcover, and I did the audiobook. If you're enjoying this, imagine 14 hours of it. It's actually people have said very nice things about it. So, although it has disabused me of the illusion that I don't have a New York accent, I always thought, oh, I have a very cultured, urban, cosmopolitan accent, but it turns out, even though I'm not from the Bronx, I'm Bronx adjacent, so it sounds like I am. So, the book was a long journey. It was not officially, it's not authorized by Stan or Marvel or anyone, so it's a completely independent. It's put out by St. Martin's Press, which is part of Macmillan, so it's a big deal publisher, which I was very pleased about. No, I had to approach him as objectively as I could. And I guess when you said you go to the library, problem with going to the library, yes, there's a lot of great scholarship and, many interesting books, but especially on the internet, but also in printed books, a lot of kind of half-truths or total fabrications get printed and repeated, and and there's 100 points of view on everything Stan did. So I did about 50 interviews. I did 2 lengthy interviews with Stan. When I told him I was doing the book, he said, "Well, good luck with it, but I don't want to be interviewed. I'm too busy, and and I won't tell people to talk to you or not talk to you." But he did give me 2 lengthy interviews ultimately. And I think after all those years, I'd learned how to interview him. I learned how to get past some of his standard stories and try to dig a little deeper. I figured there was no point in well, what about Jack Kirby? Because what was I going to get? But a lot of things about his life and his family and his background and his views on things and how he felt about working with his collaborators. I feel like I was able. One thing I pride myself on in Right Now magazine and in my books, including Superman on the Couch and Disguised as Clark Kent, to try and often succeed at getting people, especially older people, but even younger people, they have an official story of how things happened. And it's convenient, right? Somebody asks them a question and they just sort of, turn on the switch and out comes that story. Well, I think I figured out ways to get people to dig deeper or come at things from a different angle, and remember things, remember details that they might not have thought that much about. So I think that's my one of my strengths as an interviewer. And look, and there's something about spending my entire life making stories, with beginnings, middle, and ends. So I tried to make the biography, life is very often messy, and to try to impose a dramatic structure on it sometimes feels artificial, but I tried to do that as well as I could and make each chapter kind of a cliffhanger, and then Stan was alive when I started writing it, but he passed away, just as I was finishing it. So I had an ending, it was interesting. And then the weird part was because I was at Marvel and worked in, sometimes with Stan or was witness to, or on the periphery or various degrees of closeness to various events, to try to write about those with some objectivity, but also not pretending that I wasn't there. So, what I tried to do was to give voice to all the different points of view, specifically Ditko's point of view and Kirby's point of view, and just put the information out there and let people decide for themselves. Stan was a flawed human and did a lot of great stuff. He did some stuff that wasn't so admirable. Very complicated guy. And so I tried to present, I think it's clear that I respected and admired him, but I tried to put it together in a story that most critics and most commentators think is reasonably well balanced.
Well, Danny, they are telling us that we are out of time. I did want to say, just to your point, there's one section in your book where you talk about Ditko and Stan Lee meeting years later, and the fact that you are not only a witness to this, but you spoke to 2 or 3 other people who were in the room at the time. It just shows the amount of effort that you went to try and present the story as accurately as possible. And I hope sometime in the future we could talk about this again. I do want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me, and I would love to come back. Just let me know.
And I'd like to thank everyone at home for watching Comic Culture. We will see you again soon. Comic Culture is a production of the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke.